Hello everyone. This is sort of a follow-up video to a video I posted a few weeks ago about lessons I've learned from the spirit world regarding suicide. This video is similar but different. This is lessons I have learned from the spirit world regarding overdose. In the video that I made about lessons I've learned from suicide, which I'll link up here and I'll link in the description if you want to go back and watch it if you haven't. I talked about how, for some reason, I am spirit's sort of medium, or I have often gotten, since the beginning of my development as a psychic medium, a disproportionate number of suicide and overdose readings. So that means readings where spirit loved ones would themselves be taking responsibility for their transition to spirit, for their passing. Disproportionate meaning, I would say 25 to 30% of my readings with clients and during my development have been with loved ones who are on the other side as the result of suicide or overdose. So I have learned a lot about substance use disorder, about overdose, and about suicide. And I would like to share some of those with you today regarding overdose. And I will be the first to admit that prior to my spiritual journey, prior to psychic mediumship, I was one of those people who had many misconceptions about addiction, who had many misconceptions about substance use disorder. I was uneducated on the subject matter. I have since educated myself both materially and through spirit, through learning from spirit, and through just educating myself in general. But I used to be one of those people who had many judgments about it. This was, I'm talking 15 years ago. I just didn't understand it. And I think that there are still a fair amount of people out there like that today, which is why I'm making this video. I'm actually kind of ashamed to say that about myself, but at the same time, I was a very different person before this journey came barreling into my life. So I also have to give myself grace in that regard, right? We all have to give ourselves grace. People change and grow, and that's the point of this journey. But looking back, it makes sense why I had this mentality. And I just want to briefly go over this because if you have somebody in your life or people that are around you who still misunderstand addiction, who misunderstand substance use disorder, I want to urge you to exercise patience with them. And this is why. Especially if those people were born anywhere from like the late 70s to the early 90s or before that. If you were born in the late 70s to anywhere in the early 90s, you might remember the DARE program. If you went to public school, your school probably put you through the DARE program. I know I went through it. And I have memories in elementary school of, being taught of them wheeling in the big TVs on the stands where the TVs were like belted down and watching these videos, these VHS videos of, kids with the feathered hair going to parties and literally being taught about peer pressure and being offered drugs and being taught repeatedly, just say no. And as long as you just say no at parties, when you are put under peer pressure, you will never fall into a problem with drugs. Just say no to drugs. Just say no to drugs. It was drilled into our heads over and over and over, to the point of, I remember in 5th grade, we were given poster board and we had to make these dare posters of just say no to drugs, and we actually had this contest in the school. I think it was, I don't know if it was like 5th grade wide or school wide, of who could make the best just say no to drugs poster. And then the posters were plastered all up and down the hallways. So it was like, just say no to drugs and peer pressure and don't take drugs at parties. So it was like, it was drilled into our heads as kids that the route to addiction was to go to house parties as teenagers, and some evil villain of a bad seed teenager would offer you drugs in the corner, and you would, as long as you stood up to him or her, you would be safe. And that is how it was presented to us. That's what it was taught as, and that was literally drilled into our head. And drugs typically, substances typically were not spoken about within households. You know, the whole all parents think it's never going to happen to them, at least back then. Unless you had substance use in your home, then, you know, as a child, you likely had a different vantage point, or did have a different vantage point. But it was discussed in school, and that was about it. There was no social media. There was no internet for many of us, period, let alone when there was internet, there was no social media. So it's not like other types of information to better educate us were spreading, or we weren't able to hear other people's stories. Things were highly censored in that regard. So when people were, you know, becoming victim of addiction, or when opioids came about and, you know, pain medication, and it was unknown that pain medications carried addictive tendencies, and they were being prescribed in mass, and that whole, you know, epidemic came about. I don't know if the internet was even really mainstream yet, but when it did become known, social media wasn't a thing yet. So those stories were not yet able to be spread, right? So what I'm getting at here is we were essentially propagandized with the wrong information about drug use and about substance use and about what really is all encompassed within it and what really is all layered beneath the surface. Because we all know that what we were taught is like 1% of the issue, that typically does not actually happen, what we were shown, what we were taught. The intentions might have been pure, maybe, I mean, that's a whole other discussion, trying to steer us in the right direction, but it was not necessarily the best choice, because overall, the DARE program taught us the harmful effects of substances and drugs. It also created an entire generation of Americans who grew to not understand what substance use and what all goes into it actually entails, and it churned out a lot of judgment surrounding it as well. And what resulted was, until or if it comes into your life, into your family, into your circle, or it affects you personally, like you as an individual, you're not forced to evaluate those judgments or forced to unindoctrinate the teachings that you were provided. So while I don't necessarily think the DARE program was terrible, I think it was highly, highly lacking. I would just urge you that if you have a person who is still in judgment in your life, to take a few steps back before you react in anger or hurt, and consider what place their brain is reacting from. Consider what education model they are coming at the subject matter from as well. Re-education is definitely needed. I think we're getting there. I think we're in a much better place than we were, but it's definitely worth considering. I'm not saying don't place boundaries with said people if you need to for your own mental, emotional health. for those who are uninformed or highly judgmental if it's necessary for your mental emotional health, but I'm just saying empathy and understanding are necessary. I also want to say, and I think I actually forgot or I failed to mention it in the video about the lessons from suicide, but almost all, the majority of my readings with clients, the suicide and overdose loved ones, are males who are over there in the spirit realm. So statistically, that makes sense, right? Statistically, it does not make sense that 25 to 30% of my readings are suicide and or overdose. That is disproportionate to the societal statistics. That's high. But statistically, it does make sense that they're males. I looked it up before. I knew that males pass through suicide at a higher rate than females, but I looked it up specifically prior to filming this video just to see what the number was, and it's 3.88 times more likely than females. Males are 3.88 times more likely to pass through suicide, so it's 388% times more likely. An overdose, this says here, the overdose death rate for men was more than twice as high as for women in 2020, 54 per 100,000 males versus 21 per 100,000 females. So that makes sense why I tend to get mostly male spirits over there who passed through suicide. I will further state, or who passed through suicide and overdose. I will further state, and this isn't a video about suicide, this is about overdose, but I will further state that for suicide, it had stated that it was specifically white males were most at risk. It said something like 70% of suicides were by white males. It was pretty high. So I think our white males in society, in terms of this particular subject matter, need the most addressing. And I think it said something for overdoses. I think it said black males are seeing the highest rate of increase for overdoses. So in terms of this subject matter of overdoses, black males need the most attention. So in terms of lessons that I've learned from spirit working as a psychic medium regarding overdoses, one thing that I have noticed interwoven throughout my readings is that while substance use disorder is a mental health issue in and of itself, there are almost always, if not just very, very, very frequently, mental health issues pre-existing or underlying prior to the substance use beginning. And the substance use is used as a methodology for coping. And let me clarify this. Very, very often in readings, when overdose is involved, a spirit person will tell me about their mental health struggles. Specifically, they'll talk about, for example, symptoms of extreme anxiety or symptoms of extreme depression or bipolar disorder. They'll talk about that and how it affected their life, and they'll show me that, or they'll show me instances where the anxiety affected their life, situations where the loved one can validate that evidence before overdose or drug use is ever brought up. And it's like they're highlighting the mental health issues that were in their life before the drugs or the substances ever entered to begin with. They're highlighting the struggles that were there before the substances ever came into being within their existence. And they're doing this for a few reasons, I feel like. They're not doing this to bring on any guilt whatsoever. So let's just get that out of the way. There's not ever any guilt intended, like, oh, you should have seen this in me, or you should have helped me with this. Very, very often, for example, say it's a lot of the readings, unfortunately, are moms coming in with the son over there, or wife coming in with dad, or wife coming in with husband over there. Very often there were steps taken to try to help depression or help anxiety or whatever the case. But there's never any guilt to be had of like, oh, you should have done this or you should have recognized this. That's not why they're bringing this up. Go back to the video on suicide and watch the part about mental health. Everything I said in that video applies here. But they're bringing up the underlying mental health issues as a recognition in themselves as to why the substances came into their life to begin with. It's like a coping mechanism. It's a self-medication. These aren't instances of oh, I go to a party and I decide to try this, or I succumb to peer pressure and I decide to try this, or I hurt my back and I was prescribed painkillers and fell into it that way. I mean, I've had instances where that happens. That is a real that absolutely does happen. Being prescribed painkillers and then it snowballs. That absolutely does happen. But the overwhelming majority of my readings have been pre-existing mental health conditions that were life altering to the point that we are self-medicating. And that has been a big lesson from Spirit. I feel like the other reason that these are very often brought up is to help the client, the living loved ones, understand the choices, understand how it happened, and also as a society and a collective understand how we can help people before the need for rehabilitation, before the need for treating substance use disorder itself comes up. If we can intervene in the mental health precursors before it gets to that point, we could be intervening before there's a need for the substance use, right? Especially in our young men. And I say young men because typically what I have seen, there's been exceptions, but typically what I've seen in my readings, I would say is like 35 and younger. So as a collective, our mental health in our young men seems to be an area of focus and a lesson that I have learned from Spirit. The next lesson that I have learned from Spirit is that I think this plays or goes in tandem with the mental health being an underlying issue or an underlying precursor, is that even if we get a handle on substance use disorder in and of itself, if we don't address these underlying causes, overdose still happens regularly. And I say this because a fair number of the overdose passings that I have had in my readings have been people who have been clean and they slip and they overdose. And that is sad, that is terrible, that is frightening. So I know that it is typical of people who are struggling with addiction to not be able to remain sober. I know that is a typical occurrence. That's part of the disease itself, right? However, I also am putting two and two together here that from the first lesson, from the first thing that Spirit is showing me that they're struggling with, if they're struggling with depression, if we're not, anxiety, bipolar disorder, mental health, undiagnosed struggles, if we are treating the substance use disorder and not treating, or we are white knuckling it, or we're not offering the right treatment and then treating the underlying issue with it, or the root cause of what's being self-medicated, which I think is often what's happening in these cases, we are not necessarily treating the trigger or what caused them to turn towards the substances to begin with, and we lead into relapses. So PTSD is another common mental health struggle that I have seen in my practice as a psychic medium that has led to substance use disorder. So that is another one that has led to relapses, but it is frightening with the number of people that I have seen who have gotten themselves clean, relapsed, and then passes when they made it through years of usage without passing from overdose during that time, but then it happens when they relapse. So my lesson from spirit with that is, again, they keep pointing us back towards those root causes being so important in our society, those root causes being where we need to go in order to save more people, in order to understand this disease. Those root causes are where we need to focus. Because those root causes, I feel, from what spirit is telling me, those root causes drive a lot of those relapses, more so even than the substance use disorder itself drives the relapses. The third lesson from spirit regarding overdoses is that they 150% understand when relationships were severed. They understand that you had to set boundaries with them. They understand if you had to use what you would call tough love, or you had to protect yourself emotionally or even physically. If you had to protect your children or whatever the case may be, they are not angry at you or hurt or sad if you were estranged. And this is why when we transition to spirit, we transition to higher consciousness. And when we transition to higher consciousness, we shed our ego, we shed our human brain, we shed not only the illness, but we shed the part of us that does not allow us to think clearly. And we transition to higher consciousness where we can see all that is. And they are able to see the big picture. My hand is green today because I had to do an art project with my son last night. We are able to see the big picture. We are able to see why my loved ones had to do what they had to do, cause and effect relationship. They're able to see how their soul journey affected your soul journey, and everything is in love. They do not love you any less because you had to cut them out of your life, or you had to set a boundary, or you would not bring them into your home when they had nowhere else to go. They do not love you any less for that. In fact, they come through during readings and they will say things like, I was tough to deal with. You did the right thing. I know that you couldn't bring me in because of XYZ. I know that you had to kick me out of the house. They will even show me the argument or the arguments that the two of you had. And they will say things like, I was in the wrong and I understand that. So they are not angry. Anger is part of the human ego. And that human ego is what we shed when we transition to spirit, okay? Anger stays here. Anger is earth-bound. Anger is not a spirit attribute. They understand you, they love you, and they are wrapping you with everything that they have as you grieve them. And they are free from the pain and the illness that drove their actions that hurt you. And they understand the big picture of everything that I just said. The pain that drove the actions and the behavior that hurt you, that caused you to need to do the things that you did. They see that linkage and that cause and effect. And therefore, there are no negative emotions from them about any of that, only love and understanding and empathy. Final lesson regarding overdose. Soul bonds and soul connections exist regardless of the duration or the length of a physical relationship or how long two people were in one another's lives. And this is a very important lesson that goes along with the overdose subject matter, because it is very common in overdose readings for spirit and client to talk about, or for it to be brought up. I hadn't seen him in 5 years or 10 years, or there had been cut ties or estrangement before he passed, or we weren't speaking, or I don't know where he was living, those sorts of things. That happens quite often with substance use disorder. It happens much more commonly with the subject matter of overdose than it does with the subject matter of suicide, although it does happen with suicide too, but much more commonly with overdose. And so that's brought up quite often. And there is a worry with people that, we hadn't seen each other in X number of years. Is that connection still there? Is that bond still there? It is absolutely there. And it was still there even when he or she was living in the physical, even though they were sick. Their brain was sick. Their soul was not. So you have that bond with them then, and you have that bond with them now. The difference is now it's even stronger because now there's no more physical hindrance weighing them down. So that's a huge lesson, a lesson that has been learned and realized by myself as I've worked more and more and more with spirit, and clients who have come to me with their loved ones who have passed from overdose, who are wanting to realize that bond. Soul bonds and soul connections absolutely remain even when the brain was ill. It was here when they were in the physical, and it was here, and it's here even once they pass. That never goes away. That is how we are able to communicate with our loved ones. That is how they are able to clairvoyantly communicate with you, clairaudiently communicate with you, clairsentiently communicate with you. That's how you are able to communicate with them in meditation. I have a link below about my self-paced course that helps guide you through that if that's something you're interested in. But we can all communicate with our loved ones. And even if you don't take a course, if you have no interest in it whatsoever, you will receive little hits here and there of your loved one's soul communicating with your soul. If you trust yourself not to doubt what you're receiving, and if you trust them, it will absolutely happen because that soul bond is still there. It is how you know things about your living kids, about your living people, without them even needing to tell you. Because soul bonds exist amongst the living, soul bonds exist with us amongst the dead. It does not matter physical estrangement or duration of relationship. And this is no exception. I hope that this video helped you in some way, or you received some nugget of information to help you on your soul or grief journey. If you enjoyed this video, go ahead and please like and subscribe. I talk here on this channel about spirit, mediumship, the other side, animal communication, and my passion, which is helping everyday people learn to communicate with their loved ones on the other side without the help of a medium like me. Until next time, bye.